All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for turning on the recording. So I'm going to call this work session to order on AR 2020-360, appropriating proceeds of the sale of ML&P. Let's go ahead and start with a roll call, please.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Allard.
Here.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Peterson. Mr. Perez-Verdia. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
And Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
Thank you. So as usual, if members need to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat. Or if you can't access the chat, please text me. All right, so for this work session, Mr. Slivka is going to go ahead and walk us through the AR, and then we'll see if we have any questions. So turn it over to the administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you like me to share my screen so I can walk through this, or does the clerk want to?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could.
Do my best to. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Boom. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So what this does, as a very short reminder, is we've negotiated a sale over many, many years and come to an agreement on terms. I believe if there are specific questions about the terms, I think both, hopefully Anna Henderson was able to join us, but Ralph DeWare of MOA Legal is also able to answer questions. But in a nutshell, this is taking the proceeds which we're going to get, which in this case is going to start at $757,800,000, and then we're going to follow the directive as laid out on here on line 30. We're going to retire all the ML&P debt. We're going to retire any other municipal debt deemed appropriate by the Assembly, and deposit the balance into the MOA trust. And as we walk through these lines, that's what it's going to be detailed here. And so as I go along, obviously, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and the chair will govern the questioning process. So some of the, and so in terms of retiring the ML&P debt, that's roughly, 500 odd million, which we'll detail below. Line 35 describes a leaseback transaction that ran through my office, and that was used to pay for all the attorney's fees and a whole host of other fees, and that will be detailed below. Line 40 talks about some of the key bank master trust lease agreements that we have, and we have are recommending that we prepay or pay off those proportions of the outstanding leases relative to financing SAP that we believe are directly related to ML&P, just to remove that burden from the rest of the municipality. And that's where line 45 at the end of the page talks about basically 18% of the outstanding key debt is determined to be related to ML&P. And then on page 2, we talked through about the budget. So pretty straightforward. Budget was approved, budget was amended, and that gets us to line 15. We're establishing this account 170, where all the funds are going to roll through this transaction. And so here we get to line 18. As I said, we believe that we're going to start with $757,800,000, and then that's going to be reduced by various agreements that are all detailed in the APA, which I can answer specific questions about. And then the result gets us to what we're going to do with what we're recommending that we do with the money. So here, Section 1 and Section 2, these both go into the MOA trust. And the reason why there are two amounts is because the agreement calls for Chugach to give us a bunch of money, and in return, we're supposed to give Chugach a bunch of money for a variety of things, not the least of which is the rate reduction agreement, the money to be set aside for a treatment facility, and money to do a bunch of other things. And so rather than give us 757 million and we give them back roughly 50 million, we said, you know what? We're going to net those amounts, and so you're only going to give us what we believe is going to show up on October 30th, roughly 699 million. And I say roughly because, again, these numbers were all settled on using July 31 data, so we could have a set of numbers to agree upon, and then once the transaction is closed, we're going to spend 90 days bringing the financial data up through October 30th, and those are the actual numbers upon which the transaction will be based. They're going to be close to what we're talking about today, but they're going to change a little bit. And so really what we're asking for today is numbers that we believe should not change. Of course, having said that, in Section 1, there is actually, we're going to have to amend this very first one, in that if you add the 162,980,000 together with the 51,400,000, you end up with roughly 214 million. So the actual number that we're going to be putting in is closer to 229. And so we're going to actually have to figure out how to amend this first amount to change that number from 162,980,000 up to 177,740,000. The reason for that is that when this was put into the system, we had thought there was a possibility that we could recommend to you that 14,760,000 of the proceeds be used to pay down an ACDA loan in relation to the purchase of 716 4th Avenue, where police headquarters are. We would have recommended that if we could have done it, because the interest rate on that note is 5.3%. After an extensive conversation with legal, it was determined that this note was not actually a debt of the municipality, did not meet the requirements laid out in code, and so we're not going to be able to recommend that, and that's why we need to change this amount from 162,980 up to 177,740, and that would put a deposit that's going into the MOA trust of 229 million and some thousands. Questions so far?
I'm not seeing any right now.
Okay, so the next is, pursuant to the agreement, we have to pay off all ML&P debt, and ML&P has a variety of debt. So these amounts here listed in Section 3 and Section 4 together are going to pay off debt that we can pay off today, well, on closing, which are the 205 and the 09 bonds, and then defease the 2014 bonds. And so what that means is we can't pay those off because we can't call them for another number of years. And so what we do is we deposit enough money in a bank account. Well, not money. We buy enough treasury bonds and deposit them in an escrow account such that they are able to fully pay off those proceeds when the time comes. To give you an idea of that, there's a lot of bond debt service funds that are going to go towards some of this, but the principal amount outstanding is 169 million. We are going to have to deposit 202 million in order to defease that. So that's a difference of roughly $33 million. Why that difference exists is because we have an interest rate we're paying on these bonds, and we have an interest rate we're going to be able to earn on the bonds, the treasury bonds that we deposit to defease. There's a difference there. It's a negative difference, and that's why we have to deposit more money than is actually needed to defease the bonds. So for the advantage that the MOA has received by having low interest rates when we go into the GEO market, it has become a disadvantage in this case because the amount we can earn has been lessened as rates have gone down. Just to give you an idea, the cost to defease these bonds in the last year has gone up by about $7 million, which is unfortunate, but it's the market we deal with. We go on to sections, and so this we talked about earlier. This is the monies that were authorized in a leaseback transaction in order to pay for all the legal fees, all the administrative fees, everything that went into getting the municipality to the point where we could sell ML&P. To give you an idea of the scale, we know where we've spent, we'll say 8 million, and then there's been additional monies that I think ML&P has spent in getting themselves ready. Chugach has spent, we believe, a multiple of that number in order to get themselves ready to proceed with the acquisition. So seems like a lot of money in the scale of a billion-dollar transaction. These things just get expensive. Section 7, this gets to the master lease we talked about. So paying off some portion of the SAP debt, 5.4 million is the number that is outstanding. Just to give you an idea, many people remember SAP as a whole cost $82 million, but we've been paying that debt down over time. So the current amount of debt outstanding is in the mid 30 millions, so which is why this number comes up to be 5.4 million. It's going to cost us a bunch of money to close this transaction, $700,000 on Section 8. It's going to go toward legal fees, advisor fees, escrow fees, accounting fees. Section 9, Center for Treatment. As specified in the stipulated agreement, we're going to set aside $15 million coming out of the unrestricted cash, and that is going to be, as it said here, it's for the designated use as described in the purchase agreement. I should make clear that this section doesn't actually say this money gets used to buy the Golden Lion. All this money says is we're going to use 15 million for this purpose. Section 10. So we sell almost all of ML&P, but we have a little bit left over. And so that has been called Anchorage Hydropower. If you have real specific details on exactly what this is, Anna is available to answer them. But the RCA mandated that we need to capitalize that with the at least $3 million. So we're putting 3.3 million in to make sure we have both enough in terms of reserves and also money to cover any potential operating expenses. Section 11. So there are a variety of labor-related expenses. The biggest chunk of this is, I think what we've talked about many a time, is the PERS termination cost, which is going to be something around 2.7 million. There were also some other labor-related expenses, one of which was retention payments for the executive team, for specific people who remained at the utility through to give you an idea of why this was necessary and why this is very common in mergers. ML&P within, I think, their administrative, the employees that are actually covered by the PERS plan, there are 72 positions. And as of last week, I think there were 48 people in those positions. So we've seen a tremendous amount of attrition. Anna has done an extraordinary job keeping the utility running with a vastly reduced staff. And absent those retention payments, staff probably would have been reduced much further.
Before you go on, I do have a question from Ms. Kennedy.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Slipka, on that section 11 that you just covered, weren't we originally anticipating that amount to be around 20 million? For some reason, I had that figure in my mind. So am I just totally off in terms of that number, or is this actually a lesser amount than we originally anticipated?
No, you are exactly correct. The PERS termination consists of two expenses, and the total number I think is probably going to be is unknown, but is estimated to be, we'll call it 25 million maybe. And what that is there's the cost of termination, which we know and which we will owe upon closing of. We did one termination study based on who was employed. I think it was around July 30th or June 30th, and that was what came up with the 2.7 number. It actually million. The actual number will relate to the people that are actually there on October 30th, and we know for a fact there are going to be less people there on October 30th than there were June 30th. So that number will go down by a little. The other amount is you can't just say bye-bye, we're going away, because PERS has this past service liability, which we all pay every day. That's when you look at pay related to anybody who works in PERS, there's 22% of the salary goes toward this past termination. So we know that the amount we're going to have to pay in order to fully satisfy that past service liability is somewhere around, the number that's in the budget is 1.2 million a year for 20 years. We can't just show up and say, well, here's a check for 22,400,000. Are we good? Because the liability shifts as the actuarial studies are done over time. So we think we owe 1.2 million for 20 years, 15 years down the road, that might change. But that's a long way of saying that you're correct. The actual number is in the 20 million. For purposes of the transaction, we can only pay the termination study, and then it will be in the budget. And if you look at the documents that Lance's team has prepared, you look for that $1.2 million number, and that's what that's for.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Slipka. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Please continue.
Okay, so section 12, this is just trying to, as ML&P goes away, not to unduly burden the rest of the MOA infrastructure. And I think, as you understand, central service intergovernmental charges are spread out across all departments. ML&P, being a very large entity, is a big payer of these. And so this $650,000 out of using it out of the unrestricted cash is going to make sure that we don't, as we finish up 2020, turn around and figure out, well, how are we going to collect from everybody else because ML&P is no longer around. So that's the purpose of that section. Section 13, in the same vein, there were a bunch of other ancillary expenses that ML&P had paid for that we are going to fund out of the cash. And so this is like ML&P together with solid waste paid for a staff position. They made some contributions to AADC, and they made some contributions towards lobbying efforts. And so those all together add up to 150,000. And so this is just us making sure that that's not, again, an undue burden on the 2021 budget. Section 14, this goes to what I said earlier. We believe that the amount we're going to deposit is 229 million. But again, based on July 31 numbers, October 30 numbers will be different, mostly because there's a component of the agreement that looks at the net book value of the municipality. And to give you a perspective, net book value is going to fluctuate primarily by how much did we spend on new infrastructure, and that's offset by how much depreciation have we had. And the ML&P has depreciation, I believe, that runs somewhere in the $2.4 to $2.5 million per month. So ML&P does the bulk of their construction in July, August, September into October. So you are going to see fluctuations in terms of, what is the actual net book calculation on July 31, what is it October 30? So what we're doing here is we're putting $10 million in a restricted account out of the sales proceeds to wait for that reconciliation. And when that reconciliation is done, then that whatever the difference is there left over will be deposited into the MOA trust fund. So it's unknown. It could be the whole 10 million, it could be 5 million, it could be 0. But we're doing this because once we put the money into the trust, we can't just take it out. It's governed by the rules that you passed at the last assembly meeting. So we're setting this aside. We know where it's supposed to go, and we're going to put it there into the trust once everything has been agreed upon in terms of how much work did you guys actually owe us for the transaction. And so the way the transaction works is there's cash left over. Right now, we think that number is 6 million, but it could be 2, it could be 12. It's not known, again, until the above mentioned reconciliation is done. But we're asking for authorization to deposit 6 million of the ML&P cash into the area-wide general fund. And that is what this resolution is attempting to accomplish. So I'll stop there and answer any questions.
Thanks. So we'll go ahead and start with Mr. Weddleton.
All right, thank you. So I guess a little disappointment. The ballot measure said approximately $1 billion, and I think we're looking at $750 million, which is a lot of money, but it's not quite the same. On that section 15, so we put money in the just general fund balance, and how is that allowed based on the ballot measure?
So 2 things. First, you'll remember that the transaction consisted of 3 payment streams. And if I get these wrong, Anna or Ralph can correct me, but it's the amount of money that we get on closing, which is this $757,800,000. Then every year we're going to get close to $10 million in payments from Chugach as a compensation for the fact that ML&P is no longer paying $10 million a year in IGCs. So the net present value of that $10 million a year over the next, I forget whether it's 30 years or 50 years, comes to several $100 million. The third payment stream relates to payments that Chugach is going to owe us relative to Eklutna, which is being renamed Anchorage Hydropower, and those I think are somewhere in the $2 to $3 million range. Those deposits actually just go straight into the MOA trust. So when you take all of those payment streams, the 757, the $10 million a year, and the $2.5 million a year over the next many years, that adds up to almost, but not quite, $1 billion. And so you had a second question relative to, so your second question was, so the transaction says from the proceeds, we either pay off debt or put it into the MOA trust. But what is left over in terms of cash on the balance sheet belongs to the MOA. And I think it would be a fair observation to say, once people figured out how much that was, they started to demand that we use that for things. Thus, the $15 million for the treatment center comes out of ML&P cash. The $36 million that goes into a rate reduction reserve, which for just for illustration purposes, should roughly reduce everybody's rates by 10% over the next 3 years. That comes out of ML&P cash. The $3 million to capitalize hydropower comes out of cash. The 2.7 for the PERS termination comes out of cash. So that's where we get to, whatever cash is left over falls to the MOA for its use.
Okay.
Answer your question.
Particularly the $1 billion, I'd forgotten about those long-term cash flows. Thank you. I'll have to think about that $6 million. I think you threw out some numbers that aren't explicitly, that I don't see explicit. Like you said, $36 million for rate reduction. So where is that in here?
So that's not in here because the way the transaction is going to work, Chugach owes us $757 million, and that gets adjusted down by this net book value adjustment. So that brings the number down to, currently we'll call it $749 million. But then we owe them the 15 million. Well, we don't owe them. We owe them the 36 million. We owe them a bunch of other monies related to deposits, gas purchase liability, Title 21 undergrounding funds. So rather than, and then some COPA stuff and gas stuff, which only Anna understands. So all that nets out to what they're actually going to give us is $699 million. So rather than they give us a bunch of cash, we give them a bunch of cash. So that's why you don't see specifically that 36 million called out here, because we're not appropriating that. That's money that's going, that's money that basically we never get because Chugach is just giving us less.
Okay. It'd be nice to see kind of those details. I mean, it sounds like you could just add some more. I mean, we have these are the appropriations, and then but all those other pieces somewhere. I mean, it sounds like you just add a dozen lines to a spreadsheet, and we could see it all broken down. Again, is that something you could do?
I will work with Jason and Anna to see if we can get that to you.
Okay, Mr. Chair, one last question.
Go ahead.
So when I add up these sections, I get 755,530,000, but at the start it says 757,800,000. So that's 2.25 million lower. What did I miss there?
Let me do some math for you and come back to you with how these all interact.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Actually, no, I'll step out. Mr. Slivka caught all the little details about the payment in lieu of taxes, IGCs, and the rate reductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to kind of tag on Mr. Weddleton's thought about having a chart or some kind of a graph, something that spells out kind of all of the costs. And specifically, I was interested in having all of the actual costs of just the process, not, money going to this person or to this different fund or whatever, but what is the cost of actually having to have done this process? So whether that's attorneys or escrow, or just kind of the costs of this entire negotiation and process. If we could kind of get a sense, of what that number is, that would be helpful too. Thank you.
We can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or discussion? Okay, seeing none then, thank you, Mr. Slivka, for walking us through that. Looking forward to the deliberation on Tuesday. With that, I will go ahead and end this work session and see everyone back here at 10:50.